Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest in LGIU's Fireside Chats. And this is a new interview series for the Future Local Lab programme. I'm Andrew Walker. I'm the head of research at LGIU. In this series, we're going to be joined by guests from around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with the emphasis firmly on what the sector can do now to start preparing for that future. So today, we're very lucky to be sitting down with Dr. Kevin Muldoon Smith. Kevin is an associate professor of strategic public sector finance and urban adaptation at Northumbria University with over 20 years of experience. He's an established author, policy advisor, the founder of the Adaptation, Value and Built Environment Research Group at Northumbria University, and he's had a decade of experience in senior positions in public policy development and urban regeneration in various local authorities and public sector organisations before his academic career. So he's got a lot of experience that he's going to talk to us about today. The focus of Kevin's research is primarily local government finance systems, regularly via international comparisons and intersecting issues of governance, taxation, land and property markets. But he's worked extensively with us at the Local Government Information Unit to bring out issues of local government finance into the wider public and political domain. And that's why we're particularly excited to welcome Kevin to the Future Local Lab and to have this opportunity to sit down and talk to him in a bit more detail about his research and about the findings that he has come up with from comparing local government funding systems around the world. We've had this really exciting series of detailed reports looking at various countries with very, very different systems, lots of really interesting insights. And so we're going to have a conversation about what we can learn from that about transforming local government and ensuring its sustainability into the future, which, as we all know, is incredibly important. So before we get to that, first, let's just step back for a moment. And Kevin, so I mentioned briefly that you've had a lot of experience working in and around local government. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about what you've done and what you've learnt throughout your career?
I guess there's two phases to the experience. I think many years ago, when I was younger, I worked in several local authority settings in the Northeast, from policy development, policy advice, urban regeneration, and elements of neighbourhood planning in the early noughties, really. And I think even then, what was clear was the need to cohere policy objectives with their financing. And I think that's really where my research direction went when I got into the university environment. Combining also with elements of kind of property markets, the built environment. And, it was really to kind of see how local government, initially in England, could look to kind of square the circle of devolution, decentralisation, economic growth, which is very contemporary at the moment, and the financing of local government at the same time. Because I think my frustration in practice was that often you had an awful lot of narrative around policy reform, but rarely was that kind of backed up with the underlying coordinates of how those objectives would be financed. And I think at a broader level, working in local government, there was also underlying even the financing a great deal of ambiguity in relation to what local government was actually for in England. It doesn't have a constitutional basis, and there's not a great deal of clarity around what we should be doing. And that then obviously makes it quite difficult to come up with a system of finance that works. The property angle comes into it, and that can probably feel a little bit oblique, but when you look underneath, certainly the financing of local government in this country and internationally, property markets, I think in a fairly hidden way, play a really emphatic role. Council tax, business rates in this country, elements of land value capture, Section 106, community infrastructure levy, all those type of things, And there's some of the only tools that local governments have, property tax rates, to fund local government. And I think certainly in this country, there's an argument that we're a little bit over-reliant on the proceeds of property tax. So some of my research is about how we can diversify that basket of finance so local governments aren't as reliant on the vagaries sometimes of a property market.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's something that you've talked about quite a bit in your work, is the ways that you just touched on it there, that the built environment, the sort of public space is a sort of a nexus of policy and politics and money and power. Yeah, you say a little bit more about that, about how we sort of explore those elements?
Yeah, and I think that nexus, it's kind of what I'm interested in, but it's kind of a hidden nexus, and it's often not necessarily as well connected as it could be. You have a planning application for a new development in a given local authority area. That has huge implications potentially for new tax in a local area, which may well then go and pay for a public service. But obviously that's hugely potentially influenced by the politics of the day, lobbying interests locally. So you've got a lot of interaction with, what probably sounds sometimes the little dry subject of the financing of local government, but it interconnects with huge other issues in urban areas. And I think a lot of that can be seen through the interaction with property. And I think you'll see that potentially a little bit over the next few years. You have a government that is pursuing economic growth at the same time as a set of public services that aren't working and aren't financed correctly. But there's a real need to understand how we can capture that economic growth. And certainly in the previous political cycle with the last government administration, we had business rate retention, which was all about attempting to capture the proceeds of economic growth through commercial property tax. Now, I think that was proven to kind of not really work. But it just does show the connection between politics, policy objectives, local economic growth, financing of local government, and the property sector.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting sort of window into kind of social and cultural history a lot of the time, isn't it? The kind of the history of public space and housing, and people do sort of write those histories in various ways, don't they? But you can sort of understand a lot about how a society works and the values it has, the sort of priorities it has, the kinds of politics it has, often by how people experience and use public space.
Yeah, and I think you just touched on a key word there. It's values, but you can understand that in two ways in this conversation. You've got the values of society, the values of government, but then you've got the actual value of the property, whether it's residential or commercial, and it feeds into that value, which then feeds into the underlying financing of local government. It's values, value, and valuation, isn't it?
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, I mean, you talked a little bit about the sort of, the business rates stuff, which is a very, very UK, very English kind of approach. But actually, the work that you've been doing with us over the past couple of years has been taking a very international look and doing some really in-depth work looking at how several other countries operate in terms of their governance systems and in terms of how local government finance plays into that. It's a really fascinating project. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think there was some initial research on funding constraints in local government in England with Mark Sanford. And, I think the conclusion of that project really was quite a crude conclusion, really. England has a gap in its finances and it needs to start thinking about alternative perspectives for local government finance. And I think the imperative behind the international research is to really look at locations that aren't English or part of kind of the English echo chamber of conversation. We fundamentally want to look at other systems that are intentionally very different. We've tried to look at those locations that do things differently. So, so far we've looked at Germany, Italy, Japan, and we're obviously about to publish reports on Ireland, Australia. We've got Spain, France, South Africa in the works as well. And they all do things differently. And even just coming back to that idea of business rates or commercial property tax, all locations typically have that type of tax, but it's far less dominant at the local level because there's typically more sources of income to lean upon. So there's less pressure on that commercial property tax. And other locations, the ones that I think get it right, things like Germany, Japan and Italy, they don't just have a commercial property tax related to the square footage of the property. It's also in part related to the performance of the business. So there's a clearer link between how well a local economy is doing and the local government finance system. Whereas in England, the relationship between the size of a property and business productivity and turnover is really starting to break down. The Amazons of the world, their value as an organization isn't necessarily reflected in their commercial property footprint, as it would have been the case maybe up to the early noughties, as we get different types of business model that are increasingly dominated by the internet. You go away from bricks and mortar towards bricks and clicks, and it demands a very different type of tax system.
Yeah, I like that, bricks and clicks. That's good. So in terms of some of the sort of bigger, the really big kind of global challenges, policy challenges, I'm thinking about climate transition, urban adaptation, uneven development, sort of demographic change, all these sorts of things that local governments have to deal with, have to adapt to, have to sort of lead change on. How do these different systems, do you think, sort of enable that to happen in better ways, worse ways? What have you come across?
I think the best systems have structures of subnational governance that work effectively between different entities of government. So the best systems will have a really established and clear local government system with its own constitutional basis, or at least a legislative framework that defines what it's for. You'll then have a regional government of a certain degree, but I think the best locations really make clear what regional government do and restrict it to kind of coordination and maybe big ticket items that sit well at the regional level. So again, I'm thinking of Japan, Germany, and Italy, and then you've got the central government. That, in my eyes, the better system. Central government is happy to support subsidiarity, decentralisation, devolution, and hand over some of the power to local government and some of the power to central government. And that's obviously fundamentally the opposite approach to what we have in this country historically. And I would still say today, an awful lot of the financial tools of power are still held by central government. Local government is very much subservient. Local government in this country has a great deal of responsibility and liability, but it doesn't have the proportionate financing tools to manage that situation. Germany is a great example that has underlying constitutional principles of connexity, proportionality, and effectively that means you have funded mandates rather than unfunded mandates. If local government has a responsibility to deliver something, the Constitution makes it clear that it needs to have the financing to fulfill those demands. The other systems, and this is a worldwide good practice, is a system of really clear relative needs assessment at the local level and then equalisation between locations, because inevitably some locations are going to be more buoyant in terms of their tax base than others. Some locations are going to have more social demands than others. Some locations will be more expensive to pay for and fund those social demands. So there's a need to equalise the national financial proceeds around the country to enable each location to have an element of autonomy. And I think that's one of the main findings that's come out of the project. In this country, we have a huge narrative around decentralisation and autonomy. But I think that's kind of been elided with a narrative and an argument around local government should be able to stand on its own 2 feet and be quite entrepreneurial. But I think what international evidence suggests is that that doesn't work, because then you'll have a real minority of winners and many, many losers, local authorities who can't stand on their own 2 feet. So the very best systems have an embedded autonomy, in the sense that the whole local government finance system has been designed in such a way where the proceeds of finance are equalised within the system, and then all locations have the ability to take part in autonomy in a meaningful way. And I would say in this country, that's certainly been one of the issues over the last 10, 13 years. I think the last reliable relative needs assessment was carried out probably around 2010. So since that point, you've just had less and fewer optimal outcomes, because the relationship between the financing of local government and the reality of local need, that relationship isn't understood and hasn't been understood meaningfully for many years. One other thing I'll just touch on before you come back in, Andrew, is I think in terms of the relationship between local government, regional government and central government, in most international locations, it's underpinned by a great deal of trust and collaboration, where you have methods of dialogue, you have methods of respect. The different tiers of government work together collaboratively, and I think that's also something that's a little bit missing in England. There's a great deal of skepticism around local government in terms of its ability to deliver major policy objectives in its own right. Hence why you have an awful lot of the financing that is held centrally, because local government isn't quite trusted to stand on its own 2 feet.
Yeah.
Whereas, and I think we're the outlier in that respect. Very few other locations go down that route. I think internationally, you can see a real push toward subsidiarity. I mean, subsidiarity. Something's a little bit of a opaque word, but what it basically means is, you devolve local government decision making and financing to the lowest possible scale, and it's underpinned by an economic principle that Um, you know, those services should be controlled at the level upon where the person pays the tax for it and receives the service.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. And an awful lot of international locations, to very different extents, have that fundamentally hardwired into their system.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean it's interesting, isn't it? How certainly the UK and a few other countries just sort of remain as outliers in that sort of international context.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, what do you think from your work is the sort of what drives change or what enables change to happen? Partly, I suppose, for those outliers to sort of potentially to change, but the countries that you've looked at have been through historical change, haven't they? And some of them very recent. I mean, I know Japan sort of went through quite a big reform to its governance system just in recent decades. And what have you sort of picked up about how that change can kind of happen and how it can
I
happen
think
smoothly and productively?
it's part momentum, part circumstances, and part political will. So what I mean by circumstances are local authorities in financial distress, potentially insolvent, and a real recognition around that the local government finance system isn't, in an economic sense, isn't working. It isn't fulfilling the pillars of good local government finance practice. And I think there's some parallels between Italy and Japan, who went through real decentralization change in the early to mid noughties. Italy a little bit later. They all had financial difficulties, not unlike what England is currently facing, but I would say not as bad. And that was part of a catalyst for changing the way those countries were operating. It was kind of, yeah, I would say it had a catalytic effect, because both Japan and Italy also probably had 15, 20 years of policy narrative in the kind of the local government domain and the public sector domain, where there had been pressure exerted on government to change. There'd been lots of arguments made for it, but then the circumstances at the local level kind of made the case for the situation very clearly, if that makes sense. But on top of that, you also need political will to make it happen. And I think also, and this is kind of on the drier side of the argument, real firm coordinates for what local government is. Um, Obviously, I keep tracking back to England, but at the moment, I don't think we have firm coordinates for what local government and regional government, depending on how you think about regional government, combined authorities. I don't think there's any real clear coordinates about for what those two entities should be doing. And I think you end up in a situation where each is treading on the other's toes, and there's maybe overlap in delivery. There's too much noise. You end up with local government and regional government competing for similar objectives. And there's some really simple things internationally that make the system work better, and just really simple coordinates. Simple objectives and simple, um, yeah, it's the underlying coordinates. It's the underlying objectives for what local government is, and it sounds really really simple, but we don't have that in this country. We have kind of the unwritten constitution, which is useful for certain things in the sense that it can create flexibility when you are faced with a certain situation. But it also means that within that flexibility, it opens space for those with more influence to take advantage of that flexibility, and those with less influence cannot. Whereas if you had a strong system of coordinates for what local government is, even a legislative basis, it would then allow local government to hold regional and central government to account.
Mm.
This is what we are for. These are the principles upon which we were constituted, in terms of finance and proportionate financing. We aren't getting that. Why? Please change the situation. Whereas in England, we exist in a bit of an ambiguous vacuum.
Yeah, the sort of accountability and democracy and the ways that they play into the structure, I think, in these different jurisdictions is really fascinating, isn't it? And certainly the English context has a very sort of one-dimensional idea of accountability, particularly as between sort of local authorities and central government. But in lots of other contexts, it works in a very different way, which I think enables different kinds of politics, different sorts of understandings and links to place and so on. Which I think is really interesting. I want to just move us on quickly because I know that the paper that we have coming up very soon, which you're writing at the moment, is looking at the Australian system. And that's linked to the federal inquiry into local government finance sustainability, which is publishing its report just next month. Can you tell us a little bit about that paper, about the what you found about the Australian system?
Yeah, it should be coming out hopefully the next 2 or 3 weeks. It's been really interesting because obviously I've been just talking in quite a bit of detail about subsidiarity, the strength of local government kind of being a prime place-based mover to deliver and I think manage and respond to many of the public policy challenges of the next part of this century. I think in Australia, I think what I've found in the report is that you have a very state territory based system of subnational governments. Local government isn't a creature of, in many ways similar to England, local government doesn't have a constitutional basis in any way, shape or form. It has no formal relationship with the Commonwealth government in Australia. Each local government is a creature of state-based legislation. So each state or territory will have a local government act, which effectively defines what local government is for in each of those locations. It'll define borrowing rates, cap rates for local property tax, all those type of things. But fundamentally, regional government and national government in Australia, so the Commonwealth government, it has a constitutional basis. Local government, very similar to England, doesn't exist. It's purely defined by the state or territory. So I think certainly my interpretation of the system is that local government is quite underpowered. In Australia, it doesn't have, much like England, it doesn't have fixed coordinates for what it should be doing. It has very little autonomy or discretion. For an awful lot of its objectives, it needs to go back to the state government for permission to carry out its various different delivery, and that can be incredibly constraining. Local government in Australia also has access to very few income sources, so it's a little bit like England, very much constrained around fees, charges, and property taxes. It doesn't have access to some of the bigger ticket income items you would get overseas, portions of income tax, VAT, stamp duty, road tax, anything like that. So they don't have a lot of discretion, they don't have a lot of autonomy, and they don't have a lot of power in the financial sense. And I think my sense of the system is, the Australian local government finance system is a system that was designed and has been fit for purpose for many decades. It has a system of equalisation, so that's a good thing. As I was talking about earlier on. But I think it was fit for purpose in the previous century, and the demands of local place and local government have changed. Structure in Australia is very, very old, in demand and need for huge amounts of replacement and retrofit. There's huge gaps in the equalisation of funding in Australia, particularly for those locations that are less well off. So while there is a system of relative needs assessment and there is a system of equalisation, there isn't enough cash in the overall pot from the Commonwealth government to fulfil those aims. So fundamentally it needs to be funded more. Australia, as a proportion of central government spend in terms of when it goes down to local government, it's one of the smallest percentages in the world. So there's not a great deal of cash going from central government down to local government in any way. So it has some really brilliant elements. It's got the system of equalisation. England doesn't have that. It has territorial audit systems for scrutiny, which is great. But local government, it is underpowered, and it needs more power, more resource to fulfil certainly place-based demands, community-based demands over the latter part of this century. And I think one of the wider issues is because of the territorial and state-based nature of subnational governance in Australia, is that there's a great deal of divergence between territory and state. Now, that isn't necessarily a problem, because you would expect that within a federalised or a devolved method of government. Locations can do things differently, and they really should, because different locations are different. But what is inconsistent are the systems of scrutiny and accountancy practice and the way the audit systems work. There's a great deal of divergence between the different states and territories. And that then means that certain locations are more or less resilient than others. So I'm the last person who would want to say less decentralisation, more control. But I think what you do need within a system of decentralisation which absolutely supports variegation between location and variety in approach. But you do need a consistent system of scrutiny to make sure that that greater autonomy doesn't lead to financial distress. So there's some good elements, some bad elements. And I think Australian local government, it really needs to reform if it's going to meet the needs of the demands of society in the remaining years of this century.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, and that's sort of the accountability element again. But also you mentioned resilience, and so much of this is about resilience, isn't it? And we talk a lot about the sort of financial sustainability, but it does, a lot of it does sort of add up to the resilience of a place of communities. But I wonder, I mean, you mentioned there about sort of serving the needs of people in those communities, but I'm interested in all across all of this research and all these places. What do you think? Do people's experience of these places differ because of these different governance models? If we took somebody from Germany and brought them to a place in the UK, for example, or in Australia or Italy, they would have a different experience because they'd be in a different place, of course. But is there something about the governance there that makes it different to live there? Does it create real differences, or even for staff working in those authorities?
I
Does it
think for both,
create a different sort of environment?
yeah. What I would say in both senses, for staff and for the society and the citizens within a municipal boundary. I think internationally, in almost all locations, in contrast to England, local government is more respected, and not only is it trusted by central government, it's also trusted by the inhabitants of the location. In other words, there's always going to be outliers where there's issues that aren't so efficient, but there's a much greater kind of symbiosis between local government and the people it serves. And that's from a respect point of view, but it also then enables the people in a certain location to also then take part in local government. So, the spending priorities are far more transparent. I would say local government internationally reminds us of local government in this country, probably pre-World War II, where we've seen since then a real centralisation of power and local government being reduced more and more um, over time. But yeah, I think if I was going to get a bit academic about this, I think one of the underlying principles of the study that we've been doing from a conceptual point of view is we try to advocate for thinking about local government from a complex system perspective. That's similar to how an ecology works or an ecosystem works. You could think of the banking system as a complex adaptive system. And what that means is you don't have centralized control. The whole system has localized autonomy, which then feeds into a system. And that kind of gives us a perspective where we don't need to think about that continual tension between local and center, which can get very adversarial. And I think you need that complex adaptive system perspective increasingly into the future as the challenges of local government become more and more local. Not just the challenges of local government, but the challenges of society, in terms of how we respond to climate change, in terms of how we respond to things like COVID-19.
Yeah.
All of the solutions and the management to those situations were inevitably very local as soon as they happened. But if you're going to have a system that works and can flex and can adapt to these new challenges, you need a local government system that is able to kind of modify and evolve. So you need as much kind of what they would say within the complex system um, academic community. You need redundancy in the system, you need adaptive capacity, and all of that is built in at the local level. So those locations that have autonomy, discretion over decision making, big out kind of war chests of income and finance, those locations are able to respond and respond well. But outside of that, you then need the trust within the system for local government to stand on its own 2 feet. But then you need to step out of that a little bit and realize for that trust and for that autonomy to work in every location, you do need scrutiny, you do need evaluation, you do need monitoring. And I think, again, that's something that's different to this country. You've kind of got an argument in favor of decentralization and decentralization with as few scrutiny and monitoring requirements as possible. One of the main things we've found overseas is that scrutiny and monitoring, it's not kind of despised in the way it is in England. It's not seen as this kind of scrutiny tool to kind of kick local government at different times in the political cycle. It's fundamentally seen and recognised and accepted and appreciated as part of autonomous local working. You need those scrutiny procedures. in place. You need to know if a local government is in trouble before it issues a Section 114 notice. You need to know 2 years previously. You don't take action after the local government's been set on fire for whatever reason.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting sort of segue into those big future challenges and local government being adaptable and resilient and able to respond. What role do you think academics like you or think tanks like the LGIU and others, what do researchers have to offer to local government in that picture?
I think it's about promoting and shouting very loudly about the role of local government in responding to those, let's say in this country, those major challenges that have been set out by the government. Um, it's fundamentally local government is the prime mover in virtually all of those imperatives from certainly the new government in England. And I think so. We need to kind of shout as loudly as possible about the importance and the role of local government. And I think within that, we need to be kind of promoting that softer empathy that I was talking about earlier on. It's that trust in local government. Whenever there's an issue at the local level, a major mission to be solved or a crisis to be managed, local government is the first responder. But it's also kind of the cat that gets kicked whenever anything goes wrong. And I think that situation needs to be resolved really as we go forward. Local government, it's an easy target because it happens to be there in the local location. It's got responsibility for everything. Whereas in my point of view, I think combined authorities and the new mayoralty, they get away with a little bit because actually they don't have as much responsibility for the public sector at the local level. They've got an awful lot of bandwidth in the debate at the moment. But actually, when you look at kind of doing the hard work in the local area, it is the local government. And it's about really trying to promote that reality. And I think trying to promote kind of values of respect and trust in local government to be able to do its job. The government isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination in England, but it certainly isn't anywhere near as bad as the media often portray things.
Thanks, Kevin. Look, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's really, really fascinating. There's so much really interesting, useful insight in that project, in all those papers that we've had published. They're all freely available on the LGIU website. So do go and have a look at them. And then upcoming, so there's an Australia paper coming up. Shortly after that, there'll be a paper looking in depth at Ireland, and then you mentioned France and South Africa and Spain. So we're building up a big archive of really interesting research. So watch this space, and we'll be doing more of these events and having more discussions about it. But Kevin, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.